I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the books of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. If you remember, we first looked at the Pentateuch. Those are the books Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And now we come to the next large section, the section known as the historical books. That begins with Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Those are all the histories. Later on, we'll come and look at the poetic books, Job through Song of Solomon, and then the books of the prophets. But right now, we're entering into this segment known as the historical books. When we left off, we saw in the closing chapters of Deuteronomy the death of Moses. He dies on the east side of the Jordan River. He is buried on Mount Pisgah. His grave is unknown, has not been found to this day. And the children of Israel are ready now to go into the promised land. Joshua takes them. He's their new leader. And as the book of Joshua opens up, they will be crossing over the Jordan River. First, they're going to scope it out a bit, but then they're going to cross over the Jordan River and find themselves in the promised land. Joshua chapter 1 verse 8 says, "This book of the law," this is God speaking to Joshua and to the Israelites, "this book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have success." He goes on to say, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous." Those words are actually repeated several times throughout this chapter. "Be strong and courageous. Do not tremble or be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." The very first thing they are facing as the Israelites are going to go across the Jordan River is the town of Jericho. For them it is a walled city. The Israelites do not have big giant battering rams. So it's going to be a bit of a problem how they will capture this first city. And as they capture this city, that will lead the way to all the others. Jericho is known in the Bible as the city of the palm trees. Once you go there, you can see immediately why this is the case. Even today, there are palm trees year-round that are growing there and all around the area. And that becomes one of its titles. There's a natural spring that comes up in the area, waters the area, and in the midst of what is overall a dry area, this one area has natural springs and water and vegetation, and it's a lush oasis in that part of the world. You remember the story as the Israelites are getting ready to go into the land, that Joshua sends 2 spies into the land. Remember the first time that they went in, 12 spies were sent out. 10 came back with a bad report saying, those guys are too big for us. 2 of the spies, Joshua being one of those, and Caleb came back with a good report saying, yes, they're big, but God is bigger. This time, you almost get the impression God turns to 10 potential spies and he says, you guys can just stay home. We don't want to hear your report. And now he just sends 2 spies in, and they go to Jericho, and they find themselves meeting up with a Canaanite prostitute by the name of Rahab, who says, I've heard of the God of you Israelites. I heard what your God did to the Egyptians. I've come to believe in your God. And she takes them, she protects them, she hides them, and then when no one's looking, she lets them out down over the city wall with a cord, and they enter into a covenant with her. They say, look, because you have helped us, and as long as you keep our secret, when Jericho is taken, you and your family will survive. The sign of that, you're to take this cord, and it happens to be a scarlet cord, a red cord. You're to take this cord and leave it hanging out of your window. That will be the sign. Someone has said there's a bit of a scarlet cord running through the entire Old Testament, a cord signifying, looking forward to the ultimate descendant of Rahab, because she's going to intermarry and marry into one of the Israelite families, and she will be in the descendants, she will be in the ancestries of Jesus the Messiah. Jericho falls, sure enough. They march around the city not once but 7 times, and then on the 7th day of marching around the city, they march around it 7 more times, and they blow their trumpets and they yell out, and the Lord brings the walls of Jericho tumbling down, and Jericho is taken. The next city after that is Ai. And the city of Ai, we're not sure of the exact location. Scholars are still debating, which location it might be, and we have found several possible candidates. But it seems to be, we have its location generally described in the book of Joshua, and so it's moving on a bit east up into that mountain range, the central mountain range that divides the whole land of Canaan. God had told the Israelites when Jericho fell, don't take any of the loot, don't take any of the people, don't take any of the animals, any of the possessions, because that's all dedicated to me. And one Israelite by the name of Achan had taken some loot, had sinned against the Lord, and as a result, his sin brings defeat as the Israelites go and fight against Ai. His sin brings defeat against the city until Joshua goes before the Lord and says what happened, and he's told by the Lord, this is what took place, and Achan and his family are brought out. They are punished for their sin, and now Israel is going to capture the city of Ai. After that, the next city on the agenda is Gibeon. They've already taken Jericho. They've already taken Ai. And the people of Gibeon, they hear that the Israelites are already in the land. They've captured two fairly large cities, and they're beginning to worry about this. And so what they do is they take a couple of diplomats, and they dress them in the very oldest tattered clothes that they can find, and they send them over to the hill to where the Israelites are camped. And these Gibeonites come up and they say, we're from a far away land. They don't say how far, because it was really only a mile or two. But we're from a far away land. In fact, our clothes were brand new when we set out. That's how far away it was. And we'd like to make a covenant with you. We'd like to make a treaty with you. And without checking with the Lord, Joshua and the Israelites do that. They enter into a covenant with the people of Gibeon. And then I imagine the next day they walk over the hill and see the city of Gibeon there, and surprise, these are the folks with whom you've made a covenant. But they honor it. And so the Gibeon's going to become a possession of Israel, but they will be allowed to remain in the land. Now, when the other cities of the land hear that Gibeon has entered into a covenant with Israel, that brings a problem. Joshua chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. Now, it came about when Adonizedek, we've heard a name that was similar to that. There was a name way back in early Genesis called Melchizedek. Means, Melech is king and Zedek is righteousness. Here's a name that means Lord of righteousness, Adonizedek, but he's not righteous at all. Seems to be just maybe a family name. When Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, and that's not godly Jerusalem, that's Canaanite Jerusalem, he heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed it, just as he had done to Jericho and its king. So he had done to Ai and its king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land, that he feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and its men were mighty. So the king of Jerusalem, after hearing that Gibeon has gone over to the Israelites, he puts together a confederation of kings in his area. We call these the kings from the south, because there's going to be another confederation in chapter 11 of kings further northward. And so Jerusalem and Hebron and Lachish and Eglon and Jarmuth all get together, and all of these kings band together against, well, ultimately it's going to be against little Israel, but they come up against Gibeon first. They're going to punish Gibeon for having made a treaty with Israel. Israel comes to fight for Gibeon, and the battle, you would expect the battle to take place near Gibeon, but actually the site seems to be a little bit further to the northwest, the descent of Beth Horon. Not sure how they got over there. Maybe they were going to swing around behind them or something. Not sure what the battle tactics were. But the battle is fought here at Beth Horon, and not only did the Israelites win, we read about how God himself gets into the picture. Joshua chapter 10, verse 11, and it came about as they fled from before Israel, while they were at the descent of Beth Horon, that the Lord threw large stones from heaven on them, as far as Azekah. That's considerably removed from Beth Horon. And they died, and there were more who died. So this is not a little tiny local, this isn't a couple rocks falling in one location, but this is a widespread area as far as Azekah, and they died, and there were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. Notice the stones are coming min hashamim, from heaven, from the sky, from up there. And so this takes place from Beth Horon all the way down to Azekah. That's, like I said, a rather large area where this event, this heavenly attack, is taking place. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord, verse 12, in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites. Amorites is just another word for Canaanites. Amorites before the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon in the valley of Aijalon. So the sun did stand still, and the moon stopped, until the nations avenged themselves of their enemies. And then Joshua actually does something here he hardly ever does. In fact, we don't see this very often in the Old Testament. But he quotes an outside source, a secondary historical source, to give documentation. He says, is it not written in the book of Jasher? We don't have the book of Jasher. It's a book that's long been lost. But Joshua says, is it not written in the book of Jasher? And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky, this is the quote, and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And there was no day like that before it or after. This sort of thing doesn't happen every day. This thing hasn't happened since then. There has been no day like that before or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Now, trying to explain that, I'm not going to. I'm just gonna leave the. This is obviously, I think, some sort of supernatural miracle, where the sun has the appearance, at least, of standing still. I don't know how God did it, but we're told this is a irregular special event. The next thing about which we read is, and this is in Genesis chapter 11, is a similar attack. Now, it's not going to be the sun standing still again, but a similar attack, this time centered from, if I use the English pronunciation, Hazor. If you go to Israel, they'll call it Hatzor. So forgive me if I slip once in a while and use the Hebrew pronunciation. And Hatzor and Madon and Shimron and Achshaph. These other confederation of kings up here in the north, they get together, Hatzor being the primary city. That was the largest city probably in all of Canaan. And they're going to get ready, and Joshua marches up there. This time we're not given a blow-by-blow battle of the city, of the blow-by-blow account of the battle. But again, Joshua has the victory, and now the larger part of central Canaan has been subjugated by Israel. So our outline of the book of Joshua then, we begin with an initial appeal. There's preparations to take the land, and things like circumcision and sending out the spies and a rededication, and all these things are preparatory. Then we read about the conquest of the land. We've been talking about Jericho and Ai and Gibeon and the kings of the south and the kings of the north, as the land is actually captured, chapters 6 through 12. But the book of Joshua isn't done yet. Next, beginning in chapter 13, we have the distribution of the land. Now, the way we would do this today, we would drop a nice orderly map and just put dividing lines. They didn't have maps back then. It was very rare for us to find any maps of this time in antiquity. There have been maybe a very, very, very few very crude drawings, but we don't see evidence of regular map making, and so instead that all has to be described without the benefit of a map. And that's why so many chapters are given over to the distribution of the land, as the land is parceled out. Now, that doesn't mean there's no more Canaanites there. The land has been largely taken, but there's still many, many Canaanite cities that are still in the land, and that remains yet to be done. And we'll be seeing how that progresses, not here only here in Joshua, but on into the book of Judges, and again in 1st and 2nd Samuel, all the way up maybe to 1st Kings. So the land is being distributed, and then finally there's a closing appeal, just like there was an initial appeal. Again, a closing benediction, a closing call to be strong and faithful and courageous, and Joshua at the end of the book of Joshua, he has led the Israelites, but now he's ready to die. It's been noted that when we look at the books of Genesis and Joshua, there's a culmination of promise. The Genesis ends with a promise of the bones of Joseph. Remember how that ends in Genesis chapter 50? And Joseph says, when you go into the land, take my bones with you. That's all that'll be left. and bury them in the land. And the book of Joshua now ends with the fulfillment of that promise, as Joseph has taken the bones of Joseph. He's been dead, 400 plus years, but the bones of Joseph are now brought into the land, and they are buried in the land. Joseph finally makes it into the land. As we come to the book of Judges, in Judges chapter 2, we're told about a cycle that will take us through the entire central section of this book, where first the Lord would raise up a deliverer against the oppressors, those who were oppressing Israel, and then after they had been delivered, the Israelites would find it nice for a while, but then they would begin to fall into sin, and they would do evil in the sight of the Lord. Next, God would sell them into the hands of their enemy. He would judge them, and various enemies, whether it's the Philistines or the Moabites, the Ammonites, or the people of various Canaanite groups, would bring them under bondage. The Lord would sell them into their hands. And then that would cause the people to repent, and the sons of Israel would cry out to the Lord for a deliverer. And in their repentance, the Lord would send them a deliverer, which would begin the cycle all over again. After the deliverer came, they'd fall back into sin, and the cycle goes round and round and round, and that's the entire central section of the book of Judges. We have that described in the prologue, especially in chapter 2, and so the first two chapters of Judges form a prologue. First you have a bit of a narrative, and then you are told the way it's going to sort of pan out in the rest of the book of Judges. Next we have a very short narrative, the Othniel narrative, who delivers the Israelites from Philistines, and then Ehud is mentioned, and in Ehud we begin to see the story played out a bit longer. Ehud is a social outcast. What makes him a social outcast? We read that he is a left-handed man. You say, well, what's so bad about that? I know lots of folks that are left-handed. My own older brother is left-handed. That doesn't make him a social outcast. It means he has to use a different kind of baseball mitt and maybe string his guitar a little bit differently. That doesn't make him an outcast. But in that day, if I can be not too graphic with this, imagine you use your right hand to eat in the common pot. You'd grab something to eat. They didn't always have the kind of utensils we have, and your left hand was for other things. Sort of like they didn't have toilet paper and flush toilets, so your left hand was for those sorts of things, which means that you weren't too keen about bringing a left-handed man to the table to eat at dinner. You don't know where his hands have been, and so Ehud is used by God, and God uses his left-handedness as oppressors from the east of the Jordan, in this case is the king of Moab, crosses the Jordan River and comes to where the ruins of Jericho are located. There's a nice spring there, and he sets up camp there at the site of Jericho, and he oppresses the Israelites. He demands that they bring him tribute, and Ehud comes down, and he has fashioned sort of a makeshift weapon. Now, the Israelites don't have the ability to make iron weapons, but he has taken, sort of manufactured, sort of a long pointed thing that's going to act like a knife or, stabbing sword, and he has hidden it in such a way that it won't be located, because people are going to be looking at a convenient place to find it next to his right hand. And he's left-handed, so he can hide it and he comes into the presence of the king of Moab, and he says, I have a message just for you. And oh goody, a message just for me. Maybe it's money and we don't want anybody else to see that. And the king of Moab gets rid of all of his retainers, has them go outside, and Ehud comes up and says, here's the message, and stabs the king of Moab and kills him, and then slips out another way. Now the private chamber that they were using was called in our English translation the cool roof chamber. We would translate it the bathroom. Meanwhile, his guards are outside, and they hear some grunting and groaning, and they think, well, he's just taking care of business. And in the meantime, Ehud has made his escape, and the Moabites are driven out. So that's the first, full-fledged narrative that's telling us the story of the deliverance of the Israelites. The next story is going to be about Deborah. She is a judge. That in itself is rather unusual. We have seen women characters, but never in the position of leadership in the scriptures. And yet Deborah is a judge. She's judging the Israelites. And she comes to one of the tribal leaders, Barak, and says to Barak, the Lord has called you to raise together the Israelites and go and defeat these other people that are oppressing Israel, the people of Hatzor. And Barak says, well, I'll go if you go. And Deborah says, well, just for that, I'm going to go with you. But it's going to be said that the Lord gave the enemy of Israel into the hands of a woman. And that woman is Deborah. That actually woman is someone else we'll talk about in just a moment. But Barak goes and fights. He actually comes to this mountain that we have pictured on our overhead, the mountain of Tabor. It's right on the edge of the valley of Jezreel, that big wide valley southwest of Hatzor, the same valley on which Megiddo is located. And he assembles the Israelites by this wide open valley, and the king of Hatzor and his chief general, Sisera, think, oh goody, we have them right where we want them. They're on this wide open plain. We have chariots. The Israelites don't have anything like that. They don't have cavalry. They don't have chariots. It's become very easy for us. And instead, the Israelites win the battle. We're not told a blow-by-blow description, but what we are given, the battle is described in chapter 4. In chapter 5, we have Deborah's song of victory. And in that song, we don't know quite how much is figurative language, how much would take literally, but there's reference of the flood of the Gihon, this little tiny stream that normally doesn't flood, unless maybe you had some heavy rains, and if that's what took place, then maybe the chariots all got bogged down in what now turns into a bit of a mud pit. And in any case, the Israelites win the victory. And the general Sisera, he goes running away, and he finds refuge, seeks refuge in the tent of a Israelite woman by the name of Jael. And she says, oh, you want some refuge? Here, why don't you just, let me give you something to eat, something to drink. Here, take a nap, and I'll cover you and hide you. And while he's sleeping, she takes a tent peg and a hammer and drives it through his head and kills him. Notice the woman slays the enemy of Israel with a blow to the head. We're going to see how that comes back again a second time in the book of Judges. The next story is the Gideon narrative. We've all heard of Gideon, who God comes. Actually, the angel of the Lord shows up, and Gideon he's threshing his wheat. He's a farmer, but he's doing it in a very non-conspicuous place. He's threshing the wheat, but he's in a place that you would normally use for squashing grapes, which means that's a very small hidden cave, and that's a terrible place to thresh wheat, because you need a big wide open space with lots of wind to thresh wheat. In other words, he's afraid that some of the enemies of Israel, in this case the Midianites, are going to come and steal his wheat, and so he's acting the part of sort of under wraps and sort of Secret Service Christian, and the angel of the Lord comes and says, oh, Gideon, valiant warrior. And he looks nothing like a valiant warrior. It's sort of a contradiction in terms, but God is calling him to be a valiant warrior, and God calls him to gather the Israelites together and says, I'm going to use you to you're going to lead Israel against their enemies. And Gideon says, well, I'm not so sure about that. Why don't you give me a couple of signs? And God gives signs regarding, he lays out fleece and makes the ground wet while the fleece is dry, and then likewise the next day makes the ground dry while the fleece is wet. And we even talk about, we make that a figure of speech today. We talk about laying out the fleece, trying to figure out what God wants us to do. But Gideon does that, and then he gathers the armies of Israel, and they're huge armies, but God says, you have too many people. And Gideon says, well, okay, Lord, what do you want me to do? And I want you to tell all of those who are afraid to go home. And 10,000 people just up and leave. Good third of his army just walks out. And Gideon says, well, that wasn't so good. And I have to admit, at least Gideon doesn't go home, and he might have been tempted to himself. But God says, you still have too many. Take them down to the stream or to the river to drink, and whoever just puts their head in and drinks from the river, the way an animal or dog would, send them home. Only keep those who use their hand, and don't tell them ahead of time, only keep those who use their hand to cup the water and bring it up to their mouth. And that's not the normal way of doing it, so Gideon ends up with only 300 men left. And God says, that's perfect. Now I want you to go and defeat that enemy. And Gideon's, I can imagine what he's thinking. In fact, the night before the battle, God says to Gideon, sneak up and sort of spy out the land. Don't send 10 spies, 12 spies, 2 spies. You just go yourself. And if you're really afraid, take your servant Putah. And so we read, Gideon took his servant Putah, which tells me he was a bit afraid. But he goes and spies out, and then he comes back with a plan. And his plan, he tells his men, look, I want you to take a torch in one hand and hide it within a pot so it can't be seen. And I want you to take a ram's horn, sort of a trumpet in the other hand, and surround them. And at the signal, break the pot, flash the torch, blow the trumpet, and call out the sword of the Lord for Gideon. Now, when you hear that, you say, okay, I've got a torch in one hand, I've got a trumpet in the other hand. One thing I don't have in either hand is a sword, a weapon, a shield, no kind of weaponry. But that's okay. They do what they're told. They flash the torches, they blow the trumpet, and the Midianites, thinking they're surrounded, well, they are, but only by 300, but thinking they're surrounded by a big group, they rush out, and it's in the middle of the night, and they rush out, and, here's somebody, I've got to fight him. And they begin fighting each other. And they begin killing each other, not down to the last man, but the remnant go escaping, and all Gideon has to do now is a mopping up operation. So Gideon has won the victory. Now, the Israelites, after Gideon's victory, they say to Gideon, why don't we make you our king? And Gideon says, no, don't do that. The God is your king. And I think good for Gideon. On the negative side, he says, but what you can do is you can give me a whole bunch of gold and silver. And he makes a ephod. Remember that was the sort of outer garment that a priest would wear. And he hangs that up in town. And it actually becomes a source of idolatry. And next we read about Gideon's son. After Gideon dies, his son comes on the scene, and his son is named, and I'm not sure if Gideon named him this or he changes his name to this, but his son is named Abimelech. You probably remember Abba. Ab is father, and Abi is my father, and Melech is the word for king in Hebrew. So Abimelech is my father the king. And yet Gideon said, I'm not going to be king, but Abimelech, his name, means my father the king, and Abimelech sets out to make himself a king. And thinking that any other son of Gideon might be a problem to him, he goes out and murders every one of his brothers that he can find. And he becomes an oppressor. He's not a deliverer, he's not a judge. He becomes an oppressor against Israel. And he is oppressing Israel, he's attacking cities, and he's coming to attack one city, and they've all run up into a tower, and he's come up against the tower, and he's getting ready to burn them out. And we read that a woman, we're not even told her name, a woman throws a millstone off the roof of the tower, off the top of the tower, and it hits Abimelech on the head, and he's mortally wounded, and he says to his armor bearer, quick, run me through, take your sword and kill me so that it won't be said that I was killed by a woman. And he does that, but we still say he was killed by a woman. So that we have not one but two instances in the book of Judges where a woman slays the enemy of God's people with a blow to the head. Now, where have we seen that image before? It echoes with a promise that we had all the way back in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. That picture of the serpent, and here's two individuals who were acting very serpent-like, acting like God's enemies. We had a prophecy about the enemy of God being killed with a blow to the head. He will bruise your head. And it takes place in both of these accounts. The next account that we read, and notice there's now a pattern emerging, just like we had Deborah, and Jael and Barak, where a woman slays the enemy with a blow to the head, and that corresponded to Abimelech being slain by a woman with a blow to the head. So also this is a correspondence to the Ehud narrative where we had a judge that's a social outcast. Now we read of Jephthah. He's not left-handed. It's a different sort of outcast. His mother is not sort of up to par, and so his half brothers drive him out. He becomes sort of a social outcast for no fault of his own. But he's called back when there were oppressors from the east. This time it's not Moab. This time it's Ammon, who come up against people of Israel, and Jephthah is used this time to deliver the Israelites. And he does that. There's an account at the end of the Jephthah narrative, sort of a sad account, where Jephthah, he's flushed with victory, he's thankful to God, and he says to God, when I get home, whatever comes out of my house, the first thing that comes out of my house, I'm going to give to you. And I don't know, maybe there was a cat that he didn't particularly like that would always run out of the house. I don't know what he was thinking. But he comes back, and it's his daughter who comes out of the house to greet him. And he says, oh my, I wasn't expecting that. But he keeps his vow to God. Now, the passage doesn't say this was a good thing, this was a bad thing. It just says this was a thing. But he keeps his vow to God. And it sounds like, when we read it in text, and I just take it literally, like what it sounds like. It sounds like Jephthah sacrifices his virgin daughter as a human sacrifice. And you say, where does the Bible advocate that sort of thing? I don't think the Bible does advocate this sort of thing. It's just telling us what Jephthah did. It's reporting it, warts and all. It's telling us what they did, what was good, what was bad, in this case, without commentary. Finally, we have the Samson narrative. Now, Othniel narrative was a very short one. Samson narrative is actually quite a few chapters. I like to call Samson the he-man with the she-weakness. He gets strength from the Lord, but he seems to use it in ways that he's more concerned about himself. You wonder, where is God in all this? And we're told in the book of Judges that God is using this. He's using even Samson, with all Samson's not so hot motivations. He's using that to deliver Israel. And so God uses judges, sometimes in spite of them. And he does so in the Samson narrative. Now, we're not done with the book of Judges. There was a prologue in 2 parts, and there's an epilogue in 2 parts. And in this case, we have to look a bit at the story, because it's going to come back a bit later. It's going to set forth the imagery that will take us through the rest of the historical books. So, the main argument of the book of Judges is that in those days, Israel needed a king. We read this in Judges chapter 17, verse 6 for the first time. It's actually going to be repeated several times. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And that's not a good thing. We say, hey, isn't it nice they were all doing what was right? No, they weren't doing what was right. They were doing what was right in their own eyes, not in God's eyes. Because in those days there was no king in Israel. Now, the very fact that the writer of the book of Judges is saying there was no king in Israel in those days means that by the time he's writing it, after the fact, by now there is a king in Israel. But he's talking about those bad old days when there was no king in Israel and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And now we have 2 stories in Judges, actually 3, but you'll see how this pans out. The first story is of a Levite from Bethlehem who leaves Bethlehem and he goes out in search of, something else. He's not happy with what God's given him, and he comes and meets a man of Ephraim who set up his own cultic shrine. Now, you're not supposed to set up your own cultic shrine. Not supposed to be worshiping idols or gods or any other false gods or anything like that. And this man hires the Levite, says, look, I'll pay you, a stipend, and you can be my priest. You just got upgraded. You were a Levite. Now you're more than a Levite. You're a priest, and you can be my priest. That's not a good thing, because in those days there's no king in Israel, and every man is doing what's right in his own eyes. Meanwhile, the tribe of Dan, from which Samson came, has gotten tired of living in such proximity to the Philistines. And so they've decided it's time for a move. And they up and move. And they come to Ephraim, and they come to the house of this man who's hired the Levite and has his own little cultic shrine and his own little idols. And they take the idols. And the Levite says, hey, those are the idols here. They said, well, here, you can come with us and you can be our priest. And so they take the Levite too. And the man who sponsored the Levite and who's owned the idols, he says, wait a minute, those are my idols, my priests. And they say, if you don't bug out, we're going to kill you. And he says, okay, well, I guess I don't have anything to say about that. And they leave, and they go up and they settle. They resettle as far north as you can be. It's still be in Dan, or still be in Israel. And that place is going to be called Dan, on the slopes of Mount Hermon, way, way up in the north. And that's not a good thing. And they're going to set up a place, an alternate place of worship in Dan, a place of worship other than where God calls people to worship. The second story involves a concubine from Bethlehem, and she's gone to live with her hubby up in the hill country of Ephraim. And she ran home back down to Bethlehem, and in the story she's going to be murdered, and that will spark war against the tribe of Benjamin. So let's look at that story. She's from Bethlehem, and she's married a guy up in the hill country of Ephraim, but for one reason or other, she went running home to Daddy. And she goes back to Bethlehem, to her hometown, and her husband, she's a concubine, but legally that's her husband, goes down to get her, and he gets to Bethlehem and meets up with Daddy, and they talk, and apparently everything's cool. And father-in-law actually has him stay there a few days, gives lots of nice hospitality. When he's ready to go, she says, why don't you stay one more day? Okay, I'll stay one more day. Why don't you stay? Well, I really do have to get going. And so he leaves Bethlehem, and he's headed back to the hill country of Ephraim. We're told actually he's passing near Jebus. That's the old name for the city of Jerusalem. And he decides, I don't really want to stay here because bad old Jebusites, bad old Canaanites, we know what they're like. They're sinful and they do bad things. We don't want to stay there. Let's keep going. And he goes until he gets to Gibeah, and that's a town of Benjamin. And he gets to Gibeah and he says, oh, at last I'm at an Israelite town. Everything will be okay. And he comes here looking for hospitality, and he's going to sort of camp out in the square of the city. Not that big of a city, a little village. And there's a man in Gibeah who says, you really don't want to be camping out here. This is just a bad place to camp out. Why don't you come into my house instead? And as the sun sets, the men of the city, it's all, you think, well, am I in Gibeah or am I in Sodom and Gomorrah? The men of the city surround the house where he is, and they say to the man who lives there, we hear you've got a traveler. Toss him out here. We want to know him in the biblical sense. We want to have sexual relations. We want to rape him, basically. And he said, well, that's completely antithesis of hospitality. You can't do that. And they insist, and so finally they sort of open the door, and instead of tossing out the man, they toss out the concubine. And she is raped and murdered. It's a tragic, tragic story. And he takes her body and cuts it into pieces. Now, she's dead already. She's beyond it. And cuts it into 12 pieces. And through messengers, I imagine, we're not told how he did it, but he sends 12 pieces of her body to all 12 tribes of Israel. And the Israelites, you can imagine getting an arm or a leg or a head in the mail, and you say, what on earth is this? And then it comes with a message. Here's what happened, where there should have been hospitality. Instead, there was the gross opposite of hospitality, this great sin. And the tribes of Israel say, we have to do something about this. We have to punish the town of Gibeah. And all 12 tribes, well, not all 12, but 11 of the tribes say, we have to punish Gibeah. And the tribe of Benjamin says, you can't do that. That's one of our tribes. That's one of our cities. We'll handle this internally. Naughty, naughty. And the other tribes say, no, this is a major offense. and you have 11 tribes go to war against the tribe of Benjamin that's protecting Gibeah. You see, this isn't a good story. And this is all taking place because in those days there was no king in Israel, and every man's doing what's right in his own eyes. And they fight, and actually they lose the first couple battles. And when they finally win, Benjamin is reduced to almost non-existence. Benjamin's going to become the tiniest of tribes. It will continue to survive, barely. But things have gone from bad to worse to worse to worse. And that's where the book of Judges has taken us. We turn the page, and we're out of the book of Judges, but we're not out of the land of the time of the Judges, because the book of Ruth begins in the days when the judges judged. So still in the time of the book of Judges. And here we're going to read a woman's story, where Ruth, she's a Moabitess who sort of marries into the family, and Naomi are going to return to Bethlehem. And ultimately Ruth is going to give birth to a son that will give birth to another son that will give birth to another son who will ultimately give birth to David. Now the book of Ruth starts off, I call it Naomi's bitterness. It looks like Naomi's going to be a sort of a side character, but she's actually one of the main characters here. Her husband and her sons, and of course she's with them, they're living in Bethlehem, this little tiny village south of Jerusalem, and a famine has come on the land, so they leave the promised land and they go to Moab. And while they are in Moab, her two sons each take wives for themselves, and then her husband dies and her sons die, and Naomi and her two daughter-in-laws are all left widows. And after a while, Naomi says, well, I can just stay here and die, or I think I'll just go back to Bethlehem. You gals, you stay here, you find husbands of your own. And one of those daughter-in-laws, Ruth, says, no, where you go, I'm going to go. Your God will be my God, and nothing except death will separate us. And so I guess that's the nice part of the story, but Naomi gets back to Bethlehem with Ruth in tow, and she's without sons, without a husband, in deep shame. This is an honor and shame culture. This was a very shameful thing. And she says to the people of Bethlehem, they say, don't you look a bit like Naomi? And the name Naomi meant pleasant. And Naomi says, don't call me pleasant anymore. We're going for a name change. Call me Mara. Call me bitter. And that's how chapter 1 ends. Now in chapter 2, the story begins to develop as Ruth goes out into the fields. Now they don't own any fields, so she can't go out into her fields, but in that culture, the poor were allowed to go and get a little bit of food for them to eat, just what they could gather. Can't bring big basketfuls or anything, but they can get a little bit maybe of what the servants drop, or on what's on the outside of the field. They're supposed to leave that according to law. And while she's doing that, today we would see Ruth. She would be holding one of these signs at the entrance of the interstate saying, I will work for food, or something like that. While she's doing that, she happens to meet a landowner by the name of Boaz. And he says, I've heard about how you're taking care of your mother-in-law, Naomi, and he says, may the Lord bless you, under whose wings you have sought refuge. And Ruth comes home and tells Naomi about this encounter, and Naomi says, Boaz is a relative. He's a relative, and if you remember, under the Levirate law, both in that culture as well as in the law of Moses, the closest relative would be actually required to come and take the wife of a widowed wife who has no children of her own, and have children by her that would legally be the descendants of the deceased husband. But she's a Moabitess, and they're not going to be lining up to take her. the story develops as, according to the advice of Naomi, Ruth goes by night to where, they've already gathered the wheat, but now they're threshing it. You go up to a high place and you drag something heavy over the wheat and you grind it up and you throw it in the air and let the wind carry it. And it's threshing time, and everybody's sort of camped out. And Ruth goes under cover of darkness to the place where Boaz is, and she lays down by his feet. And when he wakes up, there's somebody down. My feet are a little bit warm. What's that? And there's somebody down there, and he says, "Who are you?" And she says, "I am Ruth, your handmaiden. Spread your cloak," all the way you say that in Hebrew. Spread your wings. Remember how Boaz said, "Blessed be you, Ruth, under whose shelter, under the shelter of the Lord, you found shelter under his wings." Now Ruth says, "Spread your wings over me." It's a little play on words there. And it's a little bit of a risque. I mean, think about it. Boaz is, think about how you sleep with a cover over you, and all of a sudden there's this woman down there by the bottom parts of your covers, and she's saying, "Let me under the covers." And Boaz, this is actually it's a little bit like Ruth proposing to Boaz. Boaz, there's something you owe me, by the way. Something physical here. I don't have a child. And Boaz says, "Okay, that's fair, that's appropriate. I'm going to do that. However, there's an issue. There's a closer relative. So we really need to do this by the book. And so you stay here, we're not going to do anything physical, but you stay here, but you leave before sunrise and you don't tell anybody you came. We don't want to mess up your future relationships." And the next day, and Boaz says, "I'll take care of it." And Boaz goes the next day to that kinsman and says, now he approaches it in sort of a roundabout way. He says, "There's a piece of land nearby that's part of the family, used to belong to our cousin Elimelech, and it's available." The kinsman says, "Oh, I could always use another piece of property." And Boaz says, "The problem with it comes with Ruth." And the kinsman says, "Well, I can't do that." And we're not entirely sure why, but that's a deal breaker for him. And so they go through this little custom, this little ritual of taking a sandal off and giving it to the other party. I guess the idea is wherever the sandal walks on, that becomes like the title deed. And Boaz legally requires the right to both the property and to Ruth. And he takes Ruth and he marries her and has children by her, which will be the legal heirs of Naomi's former husband. And they have a child, and the child is taken and put into Naomi's lap as if it's her child, and she nurses the child, and the story ends with Naomi's blessing. And then it ends and it tells us, and this child gave birth to another child, who gave birth to another child, who ultimately gives birth to King David. And so it's a story of the birth of a king. And remember the refrain that you see a few times at the end of the book of Judges. In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And the book of Ruth is the answer to that, because the book of Ruth is showing how they really needed a king from Bethlehem. The king who would be King David, but really the book of Ruth is telling us a story, our story, about how we needed a redeemer. We needed a king also from Bethlehem, because the ultimate son of David is going to be Jesus, the greater king who comes from Bethlehem.